I told you to move right now, you hear me?
Sure.
You can shout all you want, but I'm not stepping back.
September 1964. Two corrupt cops walked into the Palm Cafe to arrest Bumpy Johnson on fabricated charges paid for by mob boss Vincent Gigante. Within 72 hours, he turned the tables. Both officers vanished without a trace. What happened in those missing days that would shake the NYPD to its core? To understand how it all led here, we goes back to where it truly began. It was 3:47 in the afternoon on Tuesday, September 15, 1964, when the door of the Palm Cafe on 125th Street swung open, and two white police officers stepped through the entrance, their badges visible on their chests, their hands resting on their service weapons, in the universal posture of authority backed by the implicit threat of violence. Officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski, both assigned to the 28th Precinct covering Harlem, moved directly toward the corner table where Bumpy Johnson sat with three associates conducting afternoon business over coffee and cigars. The atmosphere in the cafe went silent within seconds as patrons recognized what was happening, understood that they were about to witness a confrontation between the most powerful criminal operator in Harlem and two police officers who everyone in the neighborhood knew worked for Vincent Gigante Johnson's primary competitor in the illegal gambling operations that generated millions of dollars annually throughout New York's black neighborhoods. Sullivan reached Johnson's table first, positioning himself directly in front of where Johnson sat, while Kowalski moved to Johnson's left side, creating a tactical formation that would allow both officers to control Johnson's movements if he decided to resist. Bumpy Johnson, according to the 7 witnesses who were present in the Palm Cafe that afternoon and who spoke with the Harlem Gazette between September 16th and September 18th, 1964, looked up at the two officers with an expression that combined amusement and contempt, made no immediate move to stand, and continued holding his cigar, as though Sullivan and Kowalski were merely waiters rather than police officers attempting to arrest him. Sullivan announced in a voice loud enough that everyone in the cafe could hear clearly, "Bumpy Johnson, you're under arrest for operating an illegal gambling operation for conspiracy to distribute narcotics and for assaulting a police officer during questioning last week. Stand up, put your hands behind your back, and come with us to the precinct. Now." Johnson took a slow pull from his cigar, exhaled smoke that drifted across the table toward Sullivan's face, and asked a single question that made clear he understood exactly what was happening. "Which paycheck came in this week?" "Sullivan." Johnson asked, his voice carrying across the silent cafe. "Did Vincent Gigante pay you, or was it someone from City Hall who wants me out of the way?" According to witnesses, Sullivan's face turned a deeper shade of red that suggested genuine rage at having his corruption exposed so publicly in front of dozens of witnesses who would remember this moment and spread the story throughout Harlem within hours. Sullivan began insulting Johnson with language that witnesses declined to repeat in specific detail, though they made clear that Sullivan used racial slurs and profanity with a viciousness that suggested he had lost control of his emotions. Sullivan grabbed Johnson's arm, attempting to pull him physically out of his chair and force him to stand up to submit to the arrest through superior physical force. But Johnson remained seated, his considerable weight and strength, combined with his absolute refusal to cooperate, making it impossible for Sullivan to move him without assistance. "Resisting arrest," Sullivan said, his hand still gripping Johnson's arm, his face now purple with exertion. "That's another charge. Kowalski helped me get this criminal out of his chair and into the squad car." Kowalski moved closer, reaching for Johnson's other arm, and for several seconds, both officers attempted to physically remove Johnson from his chair through brute force, pulling on his arms, trying to upset his balance, working together to overcome his passive resistance. What happened next, according to all 7 witnesses, was one of those moments that transforms a routine arrest into a confrontation that would shake the NYPD within 72 hours. At precisely 3:49 in the afternoon, exactly 2 minutes after Sullivan and Kowalski had entered the cafe, Detective Marcus Thompson, age 38, one of only 7 black detectives working out of the 28th Precinct, walked through the door with the purposeful stride of someone who had been informed that something was about to happen and who had decided he needed to be present. Thompson surveyed the scene with a single sweeping glance and understood immediately what was happening. "Officers," Thompson said in a voice loud enough that everyone in the cafe heard him clearly, "what's the basis for this arrest? What charges are you bringing against Mr. Johnson, and do you have a warrant or probable cause?" Sullivan turned toward Thompson, his hand still gripping Johnson's arm, his face showing surprise that another officer would question his actions. "This doesn't concern you, Detective," Sullivan said. "We're executing an arrest warrant on charges of gambling, narcotics, and assault. Now let us do our jobs and get out of our way." Thompson walked closer to where Sullivan and Kowalski stood, positioning himself between Sullivan and the door, in a way that made clear he would not allow this arrest to proceed without answers. "Show me the warrant," Thompson said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "Show me the arrest warrant you claim to be executing, and show me the incident report about the alleged assault on a police officer last week." According to witnesses, Sullivan and Kowalski exchanged glances that suggested they had not expected to be questioned by another officer about the legitimacy of their arrest. "The warrant is back at the precinct," Kowalski said, his voice less confident than Sullivan's. "We can show it to you after we bring Johnson in for booking." "That's not how arrests work, Officer Kowalski," Thompson responded. "You need to have the warrant with you when you execute it, or you need to have probable cause based on specific articulable facts. What's your probable cause? What evidence do you have that Mr. Johnson committed the crimes you just alleged?" The cafe became even more silent as everyone present understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. A black detective was openly challenging two white officers about an arrest, demanding they justify their actions according to law, refusing to defer to their authority, insisting they follow legal procedures. Sullivan released Johnson's arm and turned his full attention to Thompson. "Listen, Detective," Sullivan said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but you're interfering with a legitimate arrest. You need to leave this cafe immediately, or you're going to find yourself facing disciplinary charges for insubordination and obstruction." "I'm doing my job," Thompson said calmly. "My job is to ensure that arrests are legal and properly documented. You've alleged that Mr. Johnson assaulted a police officer last week. Which officer was assaulted? When did this assault occur? Where's the incident report? Where's the officer who was allegedly assaulted? And why wasn't Mr. Johnson arrested immediately after the assault occurred, rather than waiting a week?" Sullivan's face had gone from red to purple with rage at being questioned so systematically. "You're going to regret this, Thompson," Sullivan said, pointing his finger at Thompson's face. "You're protecting a known criminal, and you're going to pay the price for choosing his side over law enforcement." "I'm protecting the law," Thompson interrupted. "The law requires that you have either a warrant signed by a judge or probable cause based on specific facts. You've shown me neither. You've made allegations without evidence. You've attempted to physically remove Mr. Johnson from this establishment without legal justification. That's not a legitimate arrest under the laws of New York State. That's kidnapping under color of authority." Thompson paused, letting his words settle. "So here's what's going to happen," Thompson continued. "You're going to release Mr. Johnson. You're going to leave this cafe. And if you believe you have legitimate charges, you're going to go back to the precinct, get a properly signed warrant from a judge, and return with proper documentation. Until then, Mr. Johnson is free to go about his business." Sullivan stared at Thompson for approximately 10 seconds, long enough that witnesses thought Sullivan might try to arrest Thompson along with Johnson. But finally, Sullivan stepped back from Johnson's table, releasing his grip on Johnson's arm. "This isn't over," Sullivan said, pointing at Johnson. "We'll be back with a warrant with everything properly documented, and then you're going downtown and your pet detective won't be able to protect you." Sullivan and Kowalski walked toward the door, but before they could exit, Johnson's voice stopped them. "Sullivan, Kowalski." Johnson said. You tell Vincent Gigante and whoever else is paying you that this situation will not be finished until I decide it's finished. You understand that this isn't over, not by a long shot. The two officers left without responding, and the cafe remained silent for several seconds after they had gone. Johnson stood up, walked over to where Thompson stood, and extended his hand. Thank you, Marcus, Johnson said quietly. You didn't have to do that. Could cost you your career. Thompson shrugged. Thompson said, but I didn't become a cop to watch other cops break the law. Those two are dirty. Everyone in the precinct knows they're dirty. Someone needed to stop them. Johnson nodded. I won't forget this, Johnson said. If you ever need anything at all, you call me. Understood? Understood, Thompson said, then lowered his voice so only Johnson could hear. Bumpy, be careful, Thompson said. Sullivan and Kowalski work for Vincent Gigante. Everyone in the precinct knows it, but nobody says it out loud. They're going to come back with fabricated evidence and a friendly judge who will sign whatever warrant they want. You stop them today, but they're not going to stop coming after you. Johnson smiled slightly. Let them come, Johnson said. I've got plans for Sullivan and Kowalski. By the time I'm done with them, they're going to wish they'd never heard my name. That evening, as darkness settled over Harlem, Bumpy Johnson convened an emergency meeting in his private apartment on Edgecombe Avenue. The men who gathered in Johnson's living room represented the core of his organization. Bub Hewlett, age 42, who served as Johnson's chief of security, and Theodore Green, age 51, who served as Johnson's attorney and legal advisor. Johnson moved immediately to the crisis that Sullivan and Kowalski's arrest attempt represented. We can't just defend ourselves anymore, Johnson said, pacing in front of the window. We have to attack. Sullivan and Kowalski are going to come back probably within days with fabricated evidence and a warrant signed by some judge who Gigante has in his pocket. If we wait for them to execute that warrant, I'm going to be arrested, and even if Green can get me released, eventually the damage will be done. Hewlett asked the obvious question. What do you want to do? Bumpy. Johnson stopped pacing and turned to face both men. I want them, Johnson said simply. I want Sullivan and Kowalski. I want to take them, question them, make them tell us everything about who pays them, how much, what other cops are working for Gigante, and I want them to write it all down, sign their names to it, give us documentation we can use as leverage. The room fell silent. Green spoke first, his voice showing careful concern. Kidnapping police officers. Bumpy, that's kidnapping, that's assault, that's a dozen other felonies that could send you to prison for the rest of your life if anything goes wrong. Is that really the risk you want to take? Johnson met Green's eyes without flinching. It's more dangerous to do nothing, Johnson said. If we do nothing, Gigante uses corrupt cops to destroy us piece by piece. If we take action, if we get documentation of their corruption, we have leverage, we have protection. I'll take that risk over the certainty of being ground down by corrupt cops who can arrest me whenever Gigante pays them to do it. The planning session continued for more than 3 hours, with Johnson, Hewlett, and Green working through every detail of how they would surveil Sullivan and Kowalski, how they would identify moments when the officers were vulnerable, how they would execute the abductions, where they would hold them, and how they would extract the confessions they needed. The location they selected was a warehouse in the Bronx that Johnson's organization used, occasionally a building outside the immediate jurisdiction of the NYPD's Harlem precincts, and far enough from residential areas that any sounds wouldn't attract attention. The method they agreed on started with polite requests for cooperation and escalated only as necessary to persuade Sullivan and Kowalski that writing detailed confessions was preferable to whatever alternatives Hewlett's security team might employ. The surveillance of Sullivan and Kowalski began the next morning, September 16th, with teams of Johnson's associates, following both officers from the moment they left their homes until they returned at night, documenting their movements, their habits, their patterns, looking for opportunities when either officer might be isolated and vulnerable. Kowalski, according to the surveillance reports, maintained regular, predictable patterns, leaving home at the same time each morning, taking the same route to the precinct, leaving work at approximately the same time each evening. Sullivan, by contrast, appeared more cautious, varying his routes, checking his surroundings, frequently displaying the awareness of someone who understood he had made dangerous enemies. By late afternoon on September 16th, Johnson had received enough surveillance reports to confirm that the optimal moment to take Kowalski would be that evening when he left the precinct after his shift and walked 2 blocks to where he parked his car on a street that was typically quiet and poorly lit. The operation would be simple. 4 men would approach Kowalski as he reached his car, present him with a choice between coming voluntarily or being forced to come and transport him to the Bronx warehouse where Johnson would be waiting. At 11:10 that night, Officer James Kowalski closed his locker at the 28th precinct, checked his watch, and realized he was leaving later than he had intended, later than he had told his wife he would be home. The day had been long and tense, filled with conversations about Thompson's interference, filled with speculation about whether Thompson would file a complaint, filled with anxiety about what would happen when he and Sullivan attempted to arrest Johnson again. Kowalski stepped out of the precinct building onto the dark streets of Harlem, the neighborhood quiet at this hour on a Wednesday night. He walked quickly, wanting to get to his car and get started on the drive back to his home in Queens, wanting to end this day. At precisely 11:15 at night, Kowalski reached his car parked on 126th Street, 2 blocks from the precinct, and had just pulled his keys from his pocket when 4 men emerged from the shadows, moving quickly to surround him, before he could unlock his car door or react. Kowalski's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, his training telling him that being surrounded by 4 men at night meant danger. But before his hand reached his weapon, one of the 4 men spoke in a voice that was polite and almost conversational, though the words carried implications that made clear this was not a casual encounter. "Officer Kowalski," the man said, "Mr. Johnson would like to speak with you about yesterday afternoon at the Palm Cafe, about the arrest you attempted to execute without proper documentation, about who paid you to attempt that arrest and what other services you've provided to the people who paid you." Kowalski looked around quickly, understanding immediately that he was surrounded with no clear escape route, that these 4 men had positioned themselves to prevent him from running or fighting or calling for help. "You can come voluntarily," the man continued, his voice maintaining that same conversational politeness that somehow made the threat more frightening. "Or we can encourage you to come. Either way, mister, Johnson wants to talk to you and you're going to have that conversation tonight. The only question is whether you make this easy or difficult." The light from the street lamp reflected off Kowalski's face, revealing the cold sweat that had begun forming on his forehead, revealing the fear in his eyes, as he understood that the game had changed completely, that Bumpy Johnson had responded to yesterday's arrest attempt not by waiting to be arrested again, but by taking action that Kowalski had never anticipated, action that put him in immediate danger, and that would force him to make choices he had never imagined about loyalty and survival, and what he was willing to do to protect himself from whatever Johnson had planned. Kowalski was driven to a warehouse in the Bronx, arriving at approximately midnight on Wednesday, September 16, 1964, transported in a vehicle with curtained windows that prevented him from seeing the route they had taken or identifying landmarks that might help him determine his location or plan an escape if the opportunity presented itself. The warehouse, according to what Kowalski would later tell investigators in his official statement, was dark and empty except for a single chair positioned in the center of the main floor, beneath a solitary light fixture that cast a harsh circle of illumination in the otherwise pitch-black space, creating an atmosphere that was not overtly threatening, but was profoundly unsettling in its stark simplicity and its suggestion of isolation from any help or rescue. Kowalski was escorted to the chair and invited in language that was polite, but left no room for refusal to sit down and wait. He sat, his hands gripping the sides of the wooden chair, his mind racing through calculations about what would happen next, about whether the NYPD would realize he was missing and begin searching for him, about whether Sullivan knew what had happened and was planning a rescue, about whether he would survive this night, or whether Bumpy Johnson had decided that eliminating corrupt police officers was preferable to the risks involved in releasing them after extracting information from them. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour to Kowalski, as he sat in that circle of light surrounded by darkness, hearing nothing but his own breathing and the occasional sound of movement somewhere in the warehouse that suggested his captors were present but remaining out of sight, letting the isolation and the uncertainty work on Kowalski's nerves, softening him up for whatever interrogation or persuasion Johnson had planned. Then the door at the far end of the warehouse opened. Footsteps echoed across the concrete floor, and Bumpy Johnson emerged from the darkness into the circle of light, moving with the casual confidence of someone taking an evening stroll through a park, rather than someone confronting a kidnapped police officer in an abandoned warehouse in the middle of the night. Johnson pulled a second chair from the shadows, positioned it directly across from where Kowalski sat, and settled into it with the relaxed posture of someone preparing for a pleasant conversation, rather than an interrogation. "Good evening, Officer Kowalski," Johnson said, his voice carrying none of the anger or threat that Kowalski had been expecting, instead maintaining a tone that was almost friendly, almost conversational, which somehow made the situation more frightening than if Johnson had been shouting or making explicit threats about what would happen if Kowalski refused to cooperate. Johnson did not raise his voice, did not make threatening gestures, did not engage in any of the intimidation tactics that Kowalski had been trained to recognize and resist during his years as a police officer. Instead, Johnson simply spoke his words, delivered with calm logic and inexorable reasoning, that made clear exactly what situation Kowalski was in, and exactly what choices he faced. "Yesterday afternoon you attempted to arrest me," Johnson said. "You had no warrant. You had no probable cause. You attempted to physically remove me from the Palm Cafe based on fabricated charges that you knew you could not support with evidence or documentation. I need to know who ordered you to attempt that arrest. I need to know how much they paid you. I need to know who else in the 28th Precinct is being paid to harass me and my operations on behalf of Vincent Gigante, or anyone else who wants me arrested or eliminated." Kowalski, despite his fear, despite the isolation and the vulnerability of his position, attempted to maintain the posture of an innocent police officer who had been kidnapped for reasons he did not understand. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kowalski said. "This is kidnapping. I'm a police officer. You're committing a felony that will send you to prison for the rest of your life when the NYPD finds you, and they will find you. They're probably already searching for me right now." Johnson smiled, the expression showing neither amusement nor malice, but rather a kind of patient understanding of the game Kowalski was attempting to play. "You're a corrupt police officer," Johnson said. "And the NYPD is not going to rescue you, because rescuing you would mean exposing the corruption that you represent, would mean conducting investigations that would reveal how many other officers are doing exactly what you're doing, taking money from criminals to arrest other criminals, using your badge as a weapon for hire rather than as a symbol of law enforcement." For the next 15 minutes, Kowalski maintained his denials, insisted he was innocent of any corruption demanded to be released, threatened Johnson with the consequences of kidnapping a police officer, cycled through all the arguments and threats he could think of that might convince Johnson to let him go, or at least to reduce the severity of whatever interrogation Johnson had planned. Johnson listened without interrupting, allowed Kowalski to exhaust himself with protests and threats, and then nodded to Bub Hewlett, who had been standing in the shadows beyond the circle of light, watching the interaction between Johnson and Kowalski with the patient attention of someone waiting for a signal to act. Hewlett stepped forward into the light, and what happened next was not described in detail by Kowalski in his later official statements, except to say that Hewlett employed persuasive techniques that convinced Kowalski that continuing to deny his corruption and refuse to cooperate would result in consequences that Kowalski did not want to experience. 10 minutes after Hewlett began his persuasion, Kowalski's attitude had changed noticeably, his defiance replaced by a more calculating assessment of his situation. 30 minutes after the persuasion began, Kowalski agreed to write down everything Johnson wanted to know. Paper and pen were produced from the darkness and placed on a small table that was brought into the circle of light and positioned in front of Kowalski's chair. "Write everything," Johnson said. "Don't leave anything out. Names, amounts, dates, services provided. Everything." Kowalski began writing his hand, shaking enough that the first few lines were barely legible sweat running down his face, despite the coolness of the warehouse at this hour of the night, each word feeling like a betrayal of his fellow officers and a confession that could destroy his career and his freedom if it ever became public. But he wrote because the alternative that Hewlett's persuasion had suggested was worse than the consequences of confession, and because some part of Kowalski's mind calculated that cooperation might lead to survival, where continued resistance would lead to something else entirely. Line by line, detail by detail, Kowalski documented his corruption. Vincent Gigante had been paying him $200 per month for the past 3 years, a total of $7,200 that Kowalski had received in cash payments, delivered through intermediaries who ensured that Gigante's name was never mentioned explicitly in these transactions, but who everyone understood represented Gigante's organization. In exchange for these payments, Kowalski had provided advance warning about planned raids on Gigante's gambling operations, had provided protection by ensuring that police patrols avoided certain locations, at certain times, had harassed competitors to Gigante's operations by conducting searches and arrests based on fabricated probable cause, had testified in court about evidence that he had not actually observed or collected. The confession expanded to include the names of 23 other officers in the 28th Precinct, who Kowalski knew were also receiving payments from Gigante officers who had discussed their corrupt activities with Kowalski in the locker room or during shared patrols, officers who had coordinated their actions to provide comprehensive protection for Gigante's operations throughout Harlem. Kowalski wrote down names, ranks, approximate amounts of money. He knew each officer was receiving specific corrupt activities he had witnessed or participated in alongside these officers. Johnson stood behind Kowalski as he wrote, reading over his shoulder, nodding when he saw Vincent Gigante's name appear in the confession, occasionally asking questions that prompted Kowalski to add additional details or clarify ambiguous statements. "Good," Johnson said quietly, as Kowalski documented another corrupt transaction. "Continue." 2 hours after he began writing, Kowalski finished the confession, signed his name at the bottom of the document with a hand that still trembled, and sat back in his chair as though the act of writing had exhausted him completely. Johnson picked up the confession, read through it carefully, checking for completeness and consistency, verifying that the names and details were sufficiently specific to be useful as documentation rather than vague allegations that could be dismissed or explained away. "Now you stay here," Johnson said, "until your partner also writes his confession. If everything matches, if the details are consistent, if I'm satisfied that you've told me the truth, then you'll be released unharmed. If you've lied, if you've left out important information, if your confession doesn't match what Sullivan tells me, then we'll need to have another conversation about honesty and consequences." While Kowalski sat in the warehouse under guard, his confession secured and his fate uncertain, Sullivan was beginning his own ordeal on the morning of Thursday, September 17, 1964. Sullivan had not slept the previous night, had spent the dark hours lying awake in his home in Queens, staring at the ceiling, worrying about Kowalski's disappearance, calculating the probability that Bumpy Johnson was responsible, and wondering whether he should flee New York immediately or whether running would only confirm his guilt and make him a target for both Johnson's organization and the NYPD's Internal Affairs Division. When his wife asked him in the morning why Kowalski hadn't come home, why Kowalski's wife had called their house 3 times during the night, asking if Sullivan knew where her husband was, Sullivan lied, said he didn't know, suggested that perhaps Kowalski had stopped for drinks after his shift and had decided to sleep it off somewhere rather than driving home drunk. The lie felt hollow even as Sullivan spoke it, and he could see in his wife's eyes that she didn't believe him, that she knew something was wrong, but was afraid to press him for the truth. Sullivan considered calling in sick, considered claiming illness that would keep him home and away from the precinct, and away from whatever investigation might be beginning into Kowalski's disappearance. But calling in sick the day after his partner disappeared would look suspicious, would draw attention, would suggest that Sullivan knew something about what had happened and was afraid to face questions. So Sullivan decided to go to work to act as though everything was normal, to maintain the appearance of innocence and concern, rather than the reality of fear and guilt. "I have to stay calm," Sullivan told himself as he drove toward Manhattan, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly enough that his knuckles turned white. Nothing has happened. Kowalski probably just took off for personal reasons. The NYPD will find him. Everything will be fine. But his hands shook despite these reassurances, and his mind kept returning to Bumpy Johnson's face in the Palm Cafe, to the promise that the situation wasn't over, to the calculation in Johnson's eyes that suggested he was planning something that Sullivan had not anticipated and would not be able to counter. At 6:15 in the morning, as Sullivan's car approached the Triborough Bridge that would carry him from Queens into Manhattan, he saw a police checkpoint ahead. 4 officers in uniform standing beside patrol cars, with lights flashing a sign indicating that vehicles should stop for inspection. Sullivan felt a moment of relief, thinking that perhaps the NYPD was already searching for Kowalski, that perhaps this checkpoint was part of that search, that perhaps Sullivan's colleagues were taking the disappearance seriously and mobilizing resources to find Kowalski quickly. Sullivan slowed his car and stopped when one of the uniformed officers signaled him to do so, rolled down his window, and reached for his police identification. "Morning, officers," Sullivan said, holding up his badge. "I'm on my way to work. What's this about?" The officer who had signaled him to stop looked at Sullivan's badge without smiling, without the professional courtesy that police officers typically showed to other officers. His expression flat and businesslike, in a way that should have warned Sullivan that something was wrong, but that Sullivan, still focused on maintaining his cover of normalcy and innocence, failed to recognize as a danger signal. "Please step out of the vehicle, sir," the officer said. "There's an issue with your vehicle registration that we need to verify." Sullivan frowned, confused by this unexpected request. "Issue with my registration? What kind of issue?" "Please step out of the vehicle now, sir." The officer repeated, his hand moving to rest on his service weapon in a gesture that transformed the request into a command. Sullivan opened his car door and stepped out onto the bridge, and in that moment he realized his mistake. Understood that these were not NYPD officers conducting a legitimate checkpoint, but rather Johnson's people, dressed in police uniforms, executing a trap that Sullivan had driven into, without recognizing the danger, until it was too late to escape. The 4 uniformed officers surrounded Sullivan within seconds, moving with the coordination of people who had practiced this maneuver, blocking any avenue of escape, their hands reaching for Sullivan's arms before he could draw his weapon, or run, or call for help. Sullivan recognized his situation instantly and reached for his service weapon, but his movement was too slow. His reaction time delayed by his confusion and his failure to recognize the trap until he was already caught in it. Hands grabbed his arms, pulled his weapon from its holster before he could draw it, forced him backward against his car with enough force that the impact knocked the breath from his lungs. "Mr. Johnson is expecting you," one of the men said, his voice carrying the same polite conversational tone that had been used with Kowalski the night before, a tone that suggested this was a routine matter, rather than a kidnapping, a scheduled appointment, rather than an abduction. Sullivan struggled, trying to break free from the hands holding him, but there were 4 of them, and only one of him, and his struggles accomplished nothing except to demonstrate how completely powerless he was in this situation. "Where's Kowalski?" Sullivan demanded. "What have you done with him?" "He's riding," one of the men said. "Now it's your turn." Sullivan was forced into a different vehicle, his own car left abandoned on the Triborough Bridge, with the keys still in the ignition doors open, a puzzle for the real police to discover later in the morning, and wonder about before eventually connecting it to Sullivan's disappearance and understanding that whatever had happened to Kowalski had now happened to Sullivan as well. The drive to the Bronx warehouse took approximately 30 minutes, during which Sullivan was held between two of Johnson's men in the back seat of the car, prevented from seeing where they were going, or attempting to escape, or doing anything except sit and think about what was going to happen when they arrived at wherever Johnson was holding Kowalski. Sullivan's mind raced through scenarios, considered the possibility that Johnson intended to kill both officers to eliminate the threat they represented, calculated the probability that the NYPD would discover what had happened in time to mount a rescue, wondered whether he should have fled the city the previous night, instead of convincing himself that everything would be fine if he just maintained his normal routine. When they arrived at the warehouse and Sullivan was escorted inside, the first thing he saw was Kowalski, sitting in a corner of the large empty space, his head down, his shoulders slumped, in the posture of someone who had been broken by hours of interrogation and who had given up whatever resistance he had initially maintained. "Kowalski!" Sullivan shouted across the warehouse. "Are you okay? What did they do to you?" Kowalski did not answer, did not look up, did not acknowledge Sullivan's presence. And his silence was more frightening than any answer could have been, because it suggested that whatever had happened to Kowalski had been severe enough to crush his will entirely, to transform a police officer who had been cocky and confident in the Palm Cafe 2 days earlier into someone who couldn't even meet his partner's eyes. Bumpy Johnson emerged from an office area at the side of the warehouse, walking toward where Sullivan stood surrounded by guards, his expression showing neither anger nor satisfaction, but rather a kind of patient determination that suggested he had done this before with Kowalski and was now prepared to do it again with Sullivan. "Good morning, Officer Sullivan," Johnson said. "Your partner has been very cooperative. Now it's your turn." Sullivan was more aggressive than Kowalski had been, more willing to fight, despite the obvious futility of resistance, more committed to maintaining his denials, despite the evidence that Kowalski had already confessed to everything. "You know what you're doing?" Sullivan shouted. "This is kidnapping a police officer. The entire NYPD is going to be searching for me. They're going to find you. They're going to find this warehouse. And when they do, you're going to prison for the rest of your life." Johnson listened to Sullivan's threats without interrupting, allowed Sullivan to shout himself hoarse with predictions of rescue and retaliation and punishment, waited until Sullivan had exhausted himself and stood breathing heavily in the center of the warehouse, his face red with exertion and rage. Then Johnson spoke, his voice carrying the same calm, deadly logic that had eventually broken through Kowalski's resistance the night before. "The NYPD doesn't care about you, Sullivan," Johnson said. "You're a corrupt cop. They know it. Everyone knows it. The only reason you haven't been arrested already is because investigating you would mean investigating dozens of other cops who are doing exactly what you're doing, so don't threaten me with the NYPD coming to rescue you. The NYPD is going to be more interested in covering up your corruption than in rescuing you from the consequences of that corruption." The psychological confrontation between Johnson and Sullivan continued for hours, with Sullivan arguing that he was innocent, that he had done nothing wrong, that his arrest attempt at the Palm Cafe had been legitimate, that Johnson had no right to hold him, or question him, or demand any kind of confession from him. Johnson countered each argument, methodically dismantling Sullivan's denials with logic and with references to evidence that Kowalski had already provided in his confession, pointing out inconsistencies in Sullivan's claims, demonstrating that Sullivan's protests were transparent lies that no one believed, including Sullivan himself. As hours passed and Sullivan's resistance showed no signs of weakening through argument alone, Johnson nodded to Hewlett, and the same persuasive techniques that had been used on Kowalski were now applied to Sullivan with the same patient, systematic approach. Sullivan proved more resistant to physical persuasion than Kowalski had been maintained. His refusal to cooperate longer endured more discomfort before finally acknowledging that continued resistance was going to result in consequences that even his stubbornness could not withstand indefinitely. 3 hours after the persuasion began, Sullivan surrendered. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "I'll write it. Get me paper and pen." Sullivan wrote with anger, evident in every line, his handwriting sharp and aggressive, where Kowalski's had been shaky and uncertain. But the content was detailed and comprehensive, because Sullivan understood that incomplete or dishonest confession would only prolong his captivity and his suffering. 8 years of corruption poured out onto the pages, 8 years during which Sullivan had been on Vincent Gigante's payroll, during which he had received approximately $60,000 in total payments, during which he had provided services that went beyond what Kowalski had described, to include fabrication of evidence, perjured testimony, and court physical harassment of people Gigante wanted intimidated, and coordination with other corrupt officers to ensure comprehensive protection for Gigante's operations throughout Harlem and the Bronx. The confession expanded beyond Gigante to include payments Sullivan had received from City Councilman Robert Hayes, a politician who had paid Sullivan and other officers to provide security for illegal card games. Hayes operated in his district to ignore building code violations at properties Hayes owned, to arrest people who complained about Hayes's activities or threatened to report him to authorities who might actually investigate, rather than taking payoffs to look the other way. Sullivan's list of corrupt officers overlapped substantially with Kowalski's list, but included additional names that Kowalski apparently had not known about, names of officers in other precincts who were also on Gigante's payroll, names of supervisors who were aware of the corruption and accepted payments to ensure that internal affairs investigations never gained traction. Combined, the two confessions identified 47 officers in the 28th precinct alone who were taking regular bribes from Gigante or other sources, nearly 40% of the precinct's total officer complement, engaged in systematic corruption that had been allowed to flourish for years without meaningful investigation or punishment. Sullivan wrote for 2.5 hours, producing a document that was longer and more detailed than Kowalski's confession, signed his name at the bottom with handwriting that showed his exhaustion and his recognition that he had just destroyed his own career and possibly his freedom, and sat back as Johnson took the pages and began reading through them carefully. Johnson held both confessions, Kowalski's and Sullivan's, reading them side by side, checking for consistency, verifying that the details matched, that neither officer had fabricated information or left out crucial facts in an attempt to minimize their own guilt or protect their colleagues. A smile crossed Johnson's face for the first time since Sullivan had arrived at the warehouse, a smile that suggested satisfaction with what he was reading, recognition that he had obtained exactly what he needed. "Gigante," Johnson said quietly. 43 times. His name appears 43 times in these two confessions. That's enough for the FBI to build a federal racketeering case. That's enough to send him to prison for 20 years. Johnson looked at Sullivan and Kowalski, both of them now sitting under guard in the warehouse, both of them having written confessions that could destroy their careers and their lives if made public. "You're going to stay here for another 24 hours, Johnson said. "If everything checks out, if I'm satisfied that you've told me the truth, you'll be released unharmed. If I find out you've lied, if your confessions don't match the reality I can verify through other sources, then we're going to have another conversation about honesty and consequences." The climax of this 72-hour confrontation came at 2:15 in the afternoon on Friday, September 18, 1964, when Bumpy Johnson walked through the front entrance of the 28th Precinct headquarters, carrying a black leather briefcase accompanied by his attorney, Theodore Green, and flanked by 2 bodyguards who positioned themselves near the doors while Johnson approached the desk sergeant. The desk sergeant looked up, recognized Johnson immediately, and his face went pale as he understood what Johnson's presence in the precinct meant, understood that Johnson was here about Sullivan and Kowalski, understood that whatever Johnson was about to say or do would have consequences that would ripple through the entire department. "I need to see Captain Morrison," Johnson said, his voice calm and conversational despite the electric tension that his presence had created in the precinct, "about officers Sullivan and Kowalski, and about certain irregularities in police conduct that have come to my attention." The precinct headquarters fell into absolute silence. Every officer present stopped what they were doing and turned to look at Johnson. Understanding that Johnson had both of their missing colleagues, understanding that he was bold enough or insane enough to walk into a police station and announce that fact, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of NYPD criminal relations. Captain Robert Morrison and Lieutenant Frank Chen emerged from Morrison's office within 2 minutes, both men's faces showing combinations of anger, fear, and grudging respect for Johnson's audacity in appearing at the precinct, while 2 of Morrison's officers were missing and presumably in Johnson's custody. "Mr. Johnson," Morrison said, his voice cold enough to frost the air between them, "you're either the bravest man in Harlem or the stupidest. Come into my office now." The door to Morrison's office closed behind Johnson Green Morrison and Chen, shutting out the dozens of officers who would have given anything to hear what was about to be said in that room. Morrison positioned himself behind his desk, using the furniture as a psychological barrier, and unleashed his fury before Johnson could speak. "Where are my officers?" Morrison demanded. "What have you done with Sullivan and Kowalski? If they've been harmed, I swear I'll have you arrested for kidnapping and assault and every other charge I can think of. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison. Now tell me where they are." Johnson opened his briefcase without responding to Morrison's threats, removed 2 documents, and placed them on Morrison's desk, with the careful deliberation of someone presenting evidence in a courtroom. Morrison picked up the documents and began reading, and his face, which had been red with anger, turned white as he realized what he was looking at. "They're safe," Johnson said calmly, according to Green's later account to the Gazette. "They're being held in a secure location. They're being fed regularly. They haven't been tortured or abused beyond what was necessary to encourage them to write these confessions," Johnson continued before Morrison could interrupt. "These are copies. The originals are in a safe location. If anything happens to me, if I'm arrested, if I'm harmed, if I experience any problems with police harassment going forward, those original confessions get delivered to the New York Times, to the Daily News, to the Amsterdam News, and to the FBI." Johnson laid out the consequences with the precision of a prosecutor presenting closing arguments. "Within 24 hours of publication, this precinct will be destroyed. 47 officers will be arrested. Vincent Gigante will face federal racketeering charges based on documented evidence of corrupting police officers. Councilman Hayes will be forced to resign and possibly face prosecution. Captain Morrison and Lieutenant Chen will be investigated for either participating in corruption or for gross negligence in failing to stop corruption that involved nearly 40% of the officers under your command. The NYPD's reputation will be devastated." Morrison read and reread the confessions, Chen looking over his shoulder, both men recognizing the names of officers they had worked with for years, seeing Vincent Gigante's name mentioned again and again throughout the documents, understanding that they were holding documentation of systematic corruption that had flourished under their command, and that they had either ignored or failed to detect. "This is extortion," Morrison said finally, his voice lacking the force it had carried moments before. "No," Johnson corrected. "This is an opportunity to avoid a scandal that would destroy this department. I don't want money. I don't want favors. I want one simple thing. I want to be left alone. I want corrupt cops who are on Vincent Gigante's payroll to stop harassing me on behalf of their real employer." Johnson presented his terms with the clarity of a business negotiation. "I release Sullivan and Kowalski unharmed. They return to duty. You conduct no investigation into their disappearances. You accept their story that they took unauthorized leave for personal reasons. You discipline them with suspensions, but not termination. In exchange, you ensure that I am not harassed by police going forward. Legitimate investigations based on actual probable cause are fine, but fabricated arrests, planted evidence, harassment paid for by Vincent Gigante that stops immediately." Johnson leaned forward. "If it doesn't stop, these confessions get published. Vincent Gigante's name appears 43 times in these documents. 43 times officers describe receiving money from him, taking orders from him. That documentation goes to federal prosecutors, and Gigante faces charges that could send him to prison for 20 years. Do you think Gigante wants that? Do you think the 47 officers named in these confessions want that peace or war, Captain Morrison? Take it or spend the next year dealing with the biggest corruption scandal in NYPD history. Morrison and Chen sat in silence for approximately 2 minutes, reading and rereading the confessions, occasionally looking at Johnson, with expressions that combined hatred and helpless recognition that Johnson held all the leverage. Finally, Morrison walked to his window, looked out at Harlem for a long moment, then turned back to Johnson. "We have an understanding," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. Johnson stood and extended his hand to Morrison. Morrison stared at that hand for several seconds before reluctantly shaking it. "Sullivan and Kowalski will be released at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue," Johnson said. "Unharmed. Do we understand each other?" Morrison nodded, and Johnson and Green left the office. At 2:47 in the afternoon, Johnson walked out of the 28th Precinct headquarters, while every officer watched in complete silence, having just witnessed something unprecedented: a criminal walking into police headquarters, admitting he held 2 officers captive and walking out free because he held leverage the police could not counter. That evening, in Vincent Gigante's office in Lower Manhattan, the telephone rang. Gigante listened to the report about Johnson's visit to the precinct, about the confessions, about the agreement Morrison had been forced to accept. 43 times, Gigante said, his face going pale. "My name 43 times. He slammed his fist on his desk hard enough that a glass shattered. "Johnson turned me into a hostage," Gigante said, staring out his window toward Harlem. "I underestimated him." At 8:03 in the morning on Saturday, September 19, 1964, a dark sedan pulled to the curb at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, exactly where and when Bumpy Johnson had promised the release would occur. The rear doors opened, and officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski stepped out onto the sidewalk, both men showing bruises consistent with the persuasion that had convinced them to write their confessions, but both men alive and capable of walking without assistance. The sedan drove away before either officer could think to note its license plate or identifying features, disappearing into Harlem's morning traffic as though it had never existed. Sullivan and Kowalski stood motionless for several seconds, not quite believing they had survived, not quite trusting that their ordeal was actually over. They hailed a taxi and returned to the 28th Precinct, where Captain Morrison was waiting for them in his office. The official report Morrison filed that morning stated that both officers had been kidnapped by unknown parties who had questioned them about police corruption and had released them after obtaining the information they wanted. The report made no mention of Bumpy Johnson, made no connection between the kidnappings and the failed arrest attempt at the Palm Cafe, and concluded that investigation into the kidnappers' identities was ongoing, but had produced no viable leads. Sullivan and Kowalski were suspended for 30 days without pay for unauthorized absence from duty, but faced no criminal charges and returned to active duty in late October 1964, though both men were fundamentally changed by their experience. The ripple effects of those confessions spread through the 28th Precinct like tremors from an earthquake that had shifted the ground beneath everyone's feet. The 47 officers whose names appeared in Sullivan and Kowalski's confessions lived in constant fear that Johnson would publish the documents, that one mistake, one instance of continued corruption, one attempt to harass Johnson's operations would trigger the release that would destroy their careers and possibly their freedom. Bribes from Vincent Gigante stopped flowing to most of these officers, not because Gigante suddenly became honest, but because the officers understood that accepting money from Gigante while Johnson held documentation of that corruption was suicidal. From September 1964 until Johnson's death in July 1968, Johnson experienced significantly less police harassment than he had endured in previous years, conducting his operations with a freedom that his competitors envied and that Gigante could no longer counter through corrupt police action. Morrison conducted quiet internal investigations of several officers named in the confessions, forcing some into early retirement and transferring others to precincts outside Harlem, where they would have less opportunity for corruption. But Morrison never conducted the sweeping public investigation that the confessions warranted, because such an investigation would have confirmed everything Johnson had alleged and would have created the scandal that Morrison was trying to avoid. Detective Marcus Thompson, who had triggered this entire sequence of events by challenging Sullivan and Kowalski at the Palm Cafe, was offered a promotion in recognition of his integrity and his willingness to confront corruption. But Thompson declined the promotion and requested a transfer out of Harlem. In his final meeting with Johnson before leaving the 28th precinct, Thompson said simply, "I just did my job." Johnson shook Thompson's hand and replied, "People like you make the world better." Thompson retired from the NYPD in 1972, and no one outside Johnson's inner circle ever knew the crucial role Thompson had played in September 1964, which was exactly how Thompson wanted it. The confessions themselves remained in Johnson's possession until his death from a heart attack in July 1968, serving for 4 years as the perfect shield against police harassment and against any attempt by Gigante to use corrupt officers as weapons. When Johnson died of natural causes, there was no need to publish the confessions, as his instructions had specified publication only if he was arrested or harmed, so according to his will, the original documents were destroyed. Bub Hewlett burned them personally, later telling the Gazette, "He took the secret to his grave, but the legend lives on." In Harlem today, elderly residents who remember September 1964 still tell the story, still speak reverently about the week when Bumpy Johnson proved that intelligence defeats authority when you understand leverage and how to use it properly. An old man sits on a bench at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, his grandson beside him, and the boy asks, "Grandpa, tell me about Mr. Bumpy." The old man smiles and says, "September 1964. 2 cops tried to arrest him. 1 week later, they begged to live. He didn't fire a gun, didn't use violence, just used words. 43 times. You know, son, real power isn't guns. It's what you know and how you use it." The boy nods. Not quite understanding yet, but he will remember. And one day he will understand what his grandfather meant about power and leverage and the week when documentation became more powerful than weapons.